There's a lot going on with data in defence at the moment, but how do we translate those grand strategies and architectures into actually making things happen? Well, we've got two brilliant people in conversation on that. We've got James Herbert, the CEO of Pivotl, George Carter, the Interim Chief Data Officer at the Royal Air Force, and I will hand over to you, James.
Thanks, Kevin. Hello, everyone. God, it's great to see so many people here. It was a good attendance in May, but even more this time, so it's brilliant. And I'm really delighted, George, that you've agreed to come and speak today. I'm just going to ask you to introduce yourself first, and then I'll come on to why I'm so excited, and we'll come on to the topic. So, George, if I just hand over to you. And yeah. I want you to add one thing, I did say this in my notes, is one thing you love about working in data, because all this can feel quite difficult and hard at times, so let's have some positive. You know.
Absolutely. So, hi everyone, George Carter. I support the Air Force's Interim Chief Data Officer, looking after our kind of strategy. I come to that from a research background and then a project leadership background and then moving slowly into that kind of data leadership role. I look after our transformation agenda and the program to deliver against that, and I help people with the data projects, various that are happening across the Air Force. And I'm not immune from people sending me their Power BI dashboards to debug, which should give you an indication of where we are in the Air Force. One thing I love about data, I think that there is just, it's such a cliche to say this, but there's such a huge untapped potential for what we can do with data. If I think about decision making across the Air Force's operational landscape, there is an enormous potential to what we can do. And actually for probably all the people in the room, for us, data is saving lives. And that I was thinking about that with other panel speakers that we've heard from today. Defence often thinks we're in like a special corner of the government where we're doing a very different thing, but actually we're all protecting the citizen. All of the decisions that all of us make in government have significant ramifications for the individuals of the UK. So lots of commonality from the speakers that we've heard from so far.
Great, thanks, George. So the reason I was really pleased, well, you've partly touched on it already, is to get defence out and into the wider community and discussing it. And that came, so for those that are interested in data and defence, there's a brilliant book you might want to read called The Kill Chain, which just kind of sets the whole scene about defence, data, technology, and where that should be going, given some of the threats we face in the world. And a great podcast series called War on the Rocks as well, which touches on some of those things. And I got involved with a really interesting organisation called the Defence Data Research Centre, who I would also like to get here, and they're kind of in developing research, innovation and thinking around data for the future of UK defence. And that's where I sort of indirectly came across George, because I was writing a white paper about the state of the art versus the state of the practice. So John mentioned policy earlier. We have a brilliant policy, we have a brilliant defence strategy the UK does on data, AI, data science for the future of defence. But the state of the art versus the state of the practice, the white paper was a kind of investigation into, well, that's lovely, but what's it actually like on the ground? And I came across George, who, in my view, I might be setting you up for a bit of pressure here, has got further, certainly on data platforms, than anyone I've come across in defence or in wider government. So I was really pleased to get you to come and talk about that. But you've learned some lessons as well, haven't you? So,
yeah, absolutely.
If we just go into where you've got to, what the kind of goal of when you went to the RAF to achieve was, where you've got to with the platform, and then we'll come on to the lessons after that.
Yeah, sure. And I guess to set some context, especially in the Air Force, this is true of all of defence, and it's in part true for other organisations that have field operations, for instance. But for us, and I can't claim to have invented this quote, credit goes to Carnegie Mellon University in the States, who talk about AI innovation. And I think one of the super interesting things about defence and about the Air Force is that most companies approach data and they assume things like an internet connection, access to unlimited cloud capacity, and in places we have these things, but the innovation that we will need to do is much broader than that, because we also have to be able to operate with data in hostile environments, no network connection, or intermittent network connection, under high threat. And so we need to innovate not just in the algorithm space for something like AI, but in the network space and in the hardware space and in the distributed computing space. And so there's some really interesting paradigms. And I can't pretend that we've solved all of those stuff to a great degree. And so if I talk about where we're at, I guess the Air Force has always been very good at achieving the mission, and I've got some Air Force colleagues in the room who will look at me funny if I don't say that. They are great. We are great at when there's operational pressure, when there's a demand, getting the job done. Sometimes that means people work for 23 hours a day and duct tape things together, and sometimes that means the systems are in place. So I think the Air Force problem is characterized not by an inability to do data, but by its stovepipes, and I'm sure a lot of people will resonate with that, and the fact that we've designed our aircraft and our missions to be very successful, but those exist in their aircraft and mission bubbles. And so the job that we wanted to do was to turn that into more of an ecosystem approach. And Jackie, I'd love to hear more about your ecosystem approach at DWP, because it sounds like some very similar paradigms. And we started on that journey with kind of three major principles, if you like. The first of those principles was we're too big to have one giant data team in the middle solving everyone's problems. They will not be able to understand what's actually happening within our organization, what's actually happening on operations from a kind of stood back place. So the first thing was about empowerment and giving people the tools to serve themselves rather than telling them we'll solve their problems for them. The part of that means if you're going to offer self-service tools and if you're going to offer that empowerment, you also have to let people choose their tech. And so the other thing that's a part of that principle is we tried not to be vendor specific. We tried not to go, here is the platform that you will use to do data stuff, and instead focused on saying, okay, assuming you're all going to use different tech and you're going to have different preferences and different solutions are going to be right for different spaces, how do we make sure we can get that collaborative value out of all that technology? And so a large part of our platform has been exactly that. How do you ask questions at one point without having to know Squadron Leader Gary Smith, who happens to be the owner of People Data? How can you find that central catalog, that central way of asking questions of data? But that is a brain that can talk to any number of pockets of data across our organization. The next principle was and in defense, we're expert at this, which is we're going to do something about data, and then we do a year of policy, and then we do a year of architecture, and then we do a year of ontology, and the world's moved on. And so we go, okay, we need to transform, we need to bin that transformation program, let's start another one. Year of discussion, year of policy, and we go around that cycle. And so we needed to break out of that cycle, and so what we said was, let's do this in a very value-oriented way. Let's champion the principle of data as a product in our organization, begin from the outcome, and do a thin slice of architecture, policy, metadata management, cataloging, analytics. But let's make sure we do that in a way that still builds towards our target architecture. And then the last principle, so empowerment, data as a product. The last principle is governance and trying to not allow empowerment to become a mess. Everyone's heard the kind of paradigm of your data lake becoming a data swamp, and so how do we avoid that scenario? And so we've sorted out some kind of federated governance principles that empowers people locally, but gives them quite firm direction on how they're going to manage and organize their data and what their accountabilities are. Talking to the ethics point that Sue raised, there are things that we have to worry about in defense, like legality, safety, data retention if we've made decisions on certain bits of data that we absolutely have to bake into how we do data. We cannot afford to ignore those or do them retrospectively. But balancing that need-to-know principle, which we love in defense, against a dare-to-share principle and trying to break that culture from, it's personal data, so I couldn't possibly share it with you, to, okay, let's talk through the legitimacy of your use of that and what the ramifications are, and come up with an approach that works, again, like we heard from the previous panel discussion. I think I will pause there.
That's great, yeah, you probably, no problem. So, actually, just to jump in on one point you made before coming back onto the main question, that more federated model, so what level of maturity did you have amongst where you were trying to federate it out to? Did you have to do kind of training, etc., with the teams there already?
In some places the teams are there and are mature and we're learning from them. The thing I always go into a new team with is, look, I'm going to offer you an approach, but that's not to diminish your approach. That is for you to tell me where it's wrong so that I can evolve my approach and offer it to people who are less mature than you. So pockets of maturity, people analytics in the Air Force is actually an incredible team that's quite big. And then areas where, as you might expect, people are very kind of mission focused and very kind of like, well, let's get the job done, and we don't have time for data. And then people running around behind them to pick up the threads of how we get the data assembled and make bigger decisions.
Actually, out of interest, following from Sue, did you say you did a data maturity assessment?
Yeah, so we did Sue's data maturity assessment, which was, both humbling and really positive because it gives us a huge amount of things to go on as trajectory for change. I suppose that the Air Force will have contributed to the departmental defense's return on that data assessment.
Great. So thanks for that, talking through where you've got to. And so you've done a great job to get it where you have. But we've talked a lot about, because one of the difficulties I have, even with some of my clients, is that I kind of started this out saying everyone should do a data strategy, all the foundations should be there, but I could never make the case for it. But then the danger is you end up just with dashboards and proof of concepts, and how do you kind of pull those two things together? And this title is about data as a product. And your concern is you've done this great job about getting the mandate, getting a really modern platform with an operating model to go with it, but actually losing maybe a little bit of momentum now you're further down the track. And so there's kind of why and what would you do differently?
Yeah, sure. And that's exactly the thing is that there was a period of our data journey where I walked around with the mandate from the Chief of the Air Staff saying, look everyone, like I've got my mandate, we're going to build a platform. And then we quietly beavered away to build a platform. And I would like to say that the Air Force is now in a position, and that's been very collaborative with Strategic Command in Defense, so we have one platform across defense. It's not the Air Force hasn't gone rogue here. But that platform implementation we concentrated on for a period of time, and we had the mandate. But eventually people started going, what are you guys doing again? And I talked about data as a product and beginning the data investment within those kind of teams around the Air Force as a very value-oriented thing. I think what we maybe failed to do is apply that to the overarching transformation. And so I think, if I had my time again, I would from day one be building, we'd still do the platform build, but each of those platform components would be tied to some value that the organization could see and we could shout about, because unless you keep everyone talking about your transformation, they start to get very attracted by the vendors that come in and sell them an overnight solution. And we all know those take a longer time to implement than anyone can think about. So we've done a great job of reducing the time for every analytics project, but I would definitely approach, and we're doing this now, we're rebuilding our transformation roadmap to say, look, this is where we want to be and this is where we are, so there's some gap here. But to close that gap, we're going to identify projects that deliver the Air Force return on investment and give us something to go talk to everyone about, so that the narrative internally is, we should do more of that thing that you're doing, not let us know when you're ready.
Great, yeah, so I think that's a really important point, because it came out in the white paper, is that this kind of idea of data as a product is absolutely crucial to gaining traction, because we discussed, and we won't say the names of the companies, but you'll all know some of them, is execs are attracted by shiny things that solve their problem tomorrow. You know, whether they do or not is obviously, well, they don't. But actually, those companies have marketing teams, customer success people, adoption teams. So if you're, in a sense, what you're saying, I think, is if you build your own data platform with bits and bobs of data tooling and other platforms, you've got to think about how you kind of ongoing marketing and adoption and road mapping and being transparent about the roadmap, just like those companies would.
Yeah, exactly that. And also, I think where those companies, again, we're trying not to turn anyone away. We're not trying to compete with vendors. What we're trying to do is say, great, bring your technology to the Air Force, but let me make sure that there's an ecosystem in which that can land. So if you go and hoover up a bit of logistics data over here, these people can access it when they're trying to plan an operation.
Brilliant. So I just want to switch for a second. So one of the biggest challenges that we talked about in the research and came out was the kind of HR or people model in defence as it relates to attracting and retaining data talent. So was that something you had to address, and did you do that successfully?
It's something we had to address. Listen, it's really hard to compete with industry for data skills. The government is doing a lot, defense is doing a lot to try and make the offer more attractive for data professionals, and that's definitely a problem that we've begun with. I think there's a number of solutions that we've talked about here. The first is conventional training. The people in the Air Force are very capable. We can train them to be data professionals. The second is, okay, but maybe then they become attracted by a job in industry. Well, typically an Air Force contract is longer than a kind of contract of employment outside the Air Force. So it's probably then becomes a conversation of, okay, well, but how do we make the most of that person, and how do we give them the best possible job in industry? How do we give them the best possible training so that we get some value, and then maybe they leave because they want more money or because that's where they're at. Maybe they stay because they love the mission and they want to keep doing that. But maybe being more open to that. And then the last component is, how do we make the tools easier to use? How do we make it a leveler playing field so we don't have to train people to be computer science graduates every time we want them to do stuff with data? How do we get the Tableaus, Power BIs, those drag and drop low code tools that allow them to at least do part of getting value from data?
Brilliant. Gavin, we've got 3.5 minutes left. Do you agree with that?
Go for it.
Yeah, brilliant. So I'll choose my last question carefully. I think probably the future for RAF and data, and just beyond your team and beyond the kind of technology of it, what's the goal with it as you see it?
Great question. Not one we prepared for, it's fine. No, so I think there's a couple of things. The first is there was a generic problem to solve, which is about the ecosystem that serves the 80%. But the 20% for us is super hard. How do we get systems where we can send jobs to a data system that's on an aircraft and get a result back? And maybe there are pockets of places where we can do that right now, but how do we do that universally across our fleet? How do we get new information? How do we make decisions? How do we make the planning cycle shorter? They are the places where the 80% platform doesn't touch. We need to get further out into the edge, closer to the operators at the edge, at higher classifications with knottier data sets that have more legality around them. That remaining bit for us is huge and hard, and will make the difference in whether, my personal view, make the difference in whether or not we are comfortable in the next major global event.
Brilliant, great answer. I think probably that is us done, if that's all right with you.
Brilliant. Well,
Cool.
James,
Thanks, George.
James and George, thank you very much indeed.